completed over time in 24 hours, recall instrument, availability and results. My name is David Berrigan. I'm a program director in the Health Behavior Research Branch here at NCI, and I'll be moderating this talk. The format will consist of 3 speakers. After each speaker, we'll have a question or 2, and then at the end, there should be time for further questions for all 3 speakers. Next slide. Our 3 distinguished panelists of speakers today are Charles Matthews, a senior investigator in metabolic epidemiology branch here at DCG at NCI. Then Sarah Cozy-Keetle from Cal Poly State University, San Luis Obispo, and Pedro Saint-Maurice, a research fellow also here in the metabolic epidemiology branch of DCG. So I'm delighted to kick off this webinar with Chuck Matthews.
Okay, thanks, David. Let me get my screen up here. Okay, great. So I'm going to give just an introduction for ACT24 to get things started. I'm going to start out with just my overview. Why are previous day recalls potentially useful for activity assessment and sedentary behavior? A little bit about where ACT24 came from, some of its antecedent development process. Then I want to describe the current system, and then discuss a few key concepts regarding using previous day recalls. So why previous day recalls in the first place? Well, for the longest time, questionnaire-based estimates for habitual physical activity were quite important to our field and quite useful for many reasons. But they're really challenging to fill out if you want to get a comprehensive assessment of daily activity. So when you ask somebody what they did last year, getting an estimate of their habitual activity is really cognitively difficult, if not impossible. And there's a huge cognitive maze that goes on as somebody circles down to get toward their answer for answering the question about what they did last year for particular behaviors. That said, they're not all bad. Specific elements and domains can be pretty good, I think. Exercise and recreation would be one example. But other domains like household activities and sedentary behavior can be quite limited just because they're really difficult to recall because we don't think about them while we're doing them. And so we actually spend the majority of our time in activities that are more difficult to recall. So previous day recalls essentially flip this around. Instead of asking what you did last year or last month, we ask, what did you do yesterday? And that allows us to focus in on specific memories and often individual episodes of behavior that are much easier to recall, at least over the short term. It also allows people to do more open-ended reporting that gives us a broader spectrum of behaviors. And in that process of reporting this, they often provide a lot of contextual detail about what they've been doing. So in general, my feeling is previous day recalls are often more accurate and greater detail than questionnaire-based assessments, particularly for the type, purpose, and specific domains. One challenge has been that we rarely use them as a primary measurement tool in our studies, one, because of participant burden, trying to find availability to conduct interviews and then often conducting relatively tedious interviews with individuals. There's also a huge researcher burden, training the interviewers, entering the data, coding the data, etc. But now with new technologies, of course, come new opportunities, and a lot of these challenges have been really reduced, and that's where we've moved towards today with automated self-administered versions of these that can be done on computers and tablets and mobile phones. So the genesis in some ways for my experience with previous day recalls came from the seasonal variation in cholesterol study. And this was a study done back in the 90s, but they wanted to assess how physical activity patterns change over the seasons. And they actually conducted 5 assessments over a season, over a year for 600 or so people in central Massachusetts. And Patty Friedson and Greg Klein from UMass adapted the 5-city, 7-day physical activity recall to a previous day recall format, so assessing 1 day versus 7 days. They added light intensity activities to the recall, and then added domain-specific questions about household work and leisure time activity. The validity testing was pretty promising for the recalls. People were able to recall pretty accurately what they did, and it was associated with the Baki questionnaire and accelerometry. And importantly, it also captured changes in behavior. In this particular study, we did 3 previous day recalls in each season of the year to assess seasonality. But that was very simple-minded recall, and we were also doing a lot of dietary recall-based stuff, which allowed interviewers to assess specific activities and associate them with the amounts, and the person could report all the, not activities, but foods, all the foods that they ate throughout the day. And we thought, well, that'd be great if we could do the similar thing for physical activity recall. So we developed a tool that segmented the day, which was an important way to help people focus their recalls. At that time point, we're actually surprisingly weren't even assessing sedentary behavior. We captured sitting time just to help with the time accounting. But you can see the central part here is a bunch of domain-specific activity lists that the interviewers could use to pick up the report from the participants and code a fairly specific activity about what people were doing throughout the day. And we were able to assess 24 hours worth of information in this format. And one benefit of this sort of structured electronic format is timekeeping is often fairly careful over the 24 hours, and somebody's engaged in working through the recall properly. The data are relatively clean for the most part. So that was sort of the first generation of interviewer-based stuff that I worked on. And in the meantime, the activities completed over time at 24 hours of effort was starting at NCI back in the late 2000s. Arthur Shatskin and Michael Leitzman were working on methods to do a better job of assessing physical activity in large epidemiologic studies. So the idea was to implement measures with less error, better measures, and that could be scaled for large studies of cancer prevention, which are often over 100,000 participants in mind. So it needed to be an electronic format. That is really sort of the genesis of that, and I really have the lineage of that to thank to Dr. Shatskin for his vision for this type of system. And now I want to go ahead and move forward and just introduce the ACT24 system as it currently stands today. So the system is really made up of 2 components, a researcher site and a participant site. As an individual researcher, you would register your study with the researcher site, and that would allow you to introduce participant ID numbers and receive back from the system participant access keys that you could then send to your participants to get them access to the participant site. So to conduct a study, you would develop an invitation and tracking database, send your invitations with the access keys to participants. That would allow them to go to the participant site and complete a recall. There's an automatic scoring process that occurs, and then essentially immediately after recalls are submitted, output data is available that can either be downloaded manually by the researchers, and there's also an API that allows for electronic linkages to your study management system. There's no participant contact information kept on the NCI and the ACT24 side. That all stays on the researcher side. So there's no concerns with identifiability in that regard. So let me just show you really quickly what the participant site is like and the 3-step activity entry process. The first thing to do is to find an activity, answer some follow-up questions, and then add the activity to a timeline. Finding activities looks about like this. There are 14 major categories, and you see the phone-based version of ACT24 here, and you can scroll up and down to evaluate these 14 different major activity categories. Within them, there are a total of about 175 individual activities, as well as open-ended type-in options if the person can't find their activity. If we selected housework here, that would reveal a list of more detailed activities that the individual would select specifically to report what they did. After they do that, then they start with the follow-up questions and respond to questions about duration, body posture, and for travel and exercise, a couple of additional follow-up questions. So someone would enter their what time they started and what time they ended their activity, their body position while they were doing the activity, and then they would add the activity to their timeline. And this is what that looks like. And so the timeline is really the participant's workspace to complete their interviews, and it really takes people sequentially through their day to sort of help facilitate moving through the day in an orderly manner. They can review their entries and make edits as they need to. The system helps identify gaps in the timeline that may occur or overlapping activities that may occur. So when you're ready to choose your next activity, you would choose your next activity, and participants would repeat this until they're finished with their recall. And so oftentimes people will report 20 to 25 different activities through the day. So this is a repetitive process that people generally catch on to quite readily and begin to dive in and work through their day of activity. So after the recalls are completed, we do have a handful of analytic tools that are available on the researcher site to help researchers and others use the data and do more refined and sophisticated things with it. There are two data sets that are provided. One's the detailed output data set, which provides each activity reported, and this is really one of the main places to start analysis. There's also a summary output that takes all the activities and gets to a per day calculation, so you can quickly see how much time someone reported in a given day and roughly estimates of what their activities were. We do have some quality control and checking code that's available in SAS that takes the detailed output and fixes any overlapping activities that may occur during the reporting. And identifies the primary activities as needed and recalculates activity durations. This generates a clean, detailed output file that can be used for scoring more refined estimates of activity. So what do I mean by that? We also have a second set of SAS code on the site to generate activity summaries from the detailed file. And it takes each activity and creates a daily summary in terms of hours per day or met hours per day. Here's an example from one of our studies for physical activity. This is a study of men and women from 4 different studies that use previous day recall type instruments. ACT24 is here, and this is just an example of the calculations these files will make for sedentary behavior and light and moderate to vigorous physical activity. It will also generate domain-specific estimates and allow you to select specific activities. And here's an example again from this study with 4 different previous day recalls. ACT24 is here. And you can see the domain-specific activities that can be classified using the reports from ACT24 to get a fairly detailed portrait of people's activity levels and where their activities were occurring on the previous day. So the most common question we get, well, how long does it take for people to complete ACT24 and how many activities get reported? Well, we have 3 data points that inform us on this so far in sort of a relatively large scale. The first is from the iData study and some of the validity information that Dr. Keto will talk about in a little bit that comes from this particular study. This was the first version of ACT24 that was a computer-only version that required pointing and clicking on a standard computer screen to work through the recall. In that study, the median completion time was about 30 minutes, and people on average reported 24 activities per recall. We have some additional data that are more recent using the newer version of ACT24 that I showed you, and the AmeriSpeak panel. Dr. Saint-Maurice is going to present some of these data. In that particular study, in a large nationwide sample, the median completion time was about 15 minutes, and people reported 17 to 19 activities on average. And then one other data point we have is from the Cal Poly pilot study that Dr. Keto will present some data from. And in that particular study, which was smaller, that also used the second version, the median completion time was about 26 minutes and people reported about 25 activities on average. So somewhere between 15 to 30 minutes is probably a reasonable estimate for the completion time for ACT24 for the newer version of it. So a few key concepts before I go. Variation in behaviors and natural phenomenon. That's really important to think about. When we're doing a previous day recall, we're taking a snapshot of what the person did yesterday, the day before, right? So it's naturally going to, their behavior is naturally going to vary from one day to the next. Here's an example from an old pedometer-based study that showed how measured walking distance compared to random numbers generated on a similar scale. And you can see the patterns for both of these are pretty similar. So there's a lot of variability and often random in nature for daily activities. So multiple recalls are often needed, but it really depends on your particular study goals and how much precision you need for your particular objective. It's important, I think, to shift from thinking about measuring in detail in individuals in their populations behaviors precisely and think more about the population-based summary. And it's very helpful to think that way because we're really trying to estimate in surveillance of what the population is doing. In an intervention setting, we're trying to estimate what the control group is doing compared to the intervention group and that sort of thing. If you do more than one recall per person in your study, there's statistical methods to consider and adjust for that within person random variation that would be naturally captured by the recalls. So another key concept, and this is the way we have the recall set up, is unannounced previous day recalls. We don't want to announce the recalls that are coming to avoid or reduce reactivity as much as possible. So they want to tell us what they did yesterday. They can't change what they did yesterday if they're telling you that same thing today. And then finally, just a note on optimizing recall completion. If you do need to do more than one recall, really setting the participant expectations up front to accept recall indications that come from the research study. Think about targeting X number of recalls in a given period, say 4 weeks, and plan for makeup recalls for each of your primary targeted recalls. We've often found that a primary invitation for completing a recall plus 2 makeup dates is a really good way to capture a large proportion of complete data in your population. Now, finally, just a wide range of acknowledgments. Certainly can't do any of this work all by myself. There's a huge number of people at NCI and Cal Poly and other facilitators around the country that have really helped this research along. And with that, I'll wrap up and look for a question or so. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Chuck. Terrific talk. And I'm really excited that this tool for 24-hour physical activity recalls is available in this modernized format and can serve as a complement to NCI's ASA24 dietary recall tool. So they're a beautiful matched pair to study energy balance. Time use surveys have been really valuable for international comparisons as well as epidemiological studies. So I wondered if you had any plans to translate the tool into different languages, both for within US immigrant populations and for global studies of global variation.
Not at the moment, although that's certainly a possibility. I mean, the tool is really developed essentially for work in the US at this point. And we can look into doing that on an as-needed basis. But right now it's an English-only version. If that opportunity arises in the future, is certainly something we could explore.
Terrific. In the interest of time, let's move on to our second speaker, Dr. Sarah Cozy-Keetal, who, as I mentioned, is Associate Professor in the Department of Kinesiology and Public Health at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. That's a tongue twister for me. And she's going to talk about ongoing work on validation of ACT24 and other 24-hour recall tools. Take it away, Sarah.
All right. Okay. So we're going to jump right in. I'm going to start off by talking about how we validate previous day recalls. So as Chuck mentioned, there's a variety of different methods from interview-based to computer-based one. We're going to talk about some of the different metrics we get out of previous day recalls, such as location and purpose, the posture and energy expenditure, and then talk in more detail about the ACT24 version 2 validation project that we recently completed, and finish up with some summary and future directions. So as has been mentioned, we get a whole bunch of different information out of a previous day recall. So we get some rich contextual information, so the type and purpose of activity, and we can look at those in broad categories. Was the person at home or at work or in leisure time? And then we can look at specific activities. Were they vacuuming versus driving? The criterion measure we use to validate those types of metrics are direct observation, where we follow people around. Most recently, we use video recordings to film them over the course of the day, and then validate that information. We can also get measures of posture, sitting, standing, moving, or active time. For that, we've used direct observation again as a criterion measure. But as you can imagine, it's both time and labor intensive to follow people around and to annotate those videos. And you just feasibly can't do that over a full 24-hour period. So we've also used ActivePal, which provides really strong estimates of time spent sitting versus standing. So we've also used that as a criterion measure for the postural measures. In terms of activity intensity, if we look at sedentary, light, or moderate versus vigorous, neither of these measures directly measure energy expenditure, but both direct observation and ActivePal have been shown to provide valid estimates of activity intensity. So we use those to compare to previous day recalls. And then finally, the previous day recall can give us estimates of energy expenditure over the course of the day. And this is done via a linkage that was done a while ago with the Compendium of Physical Activities. And that's one of the summary metrics that comes out of the scoring system. And for that, we validated the ACT24 against doubly labeled water. So this was an early study looking at the accuracy of location and purpose as compared to the previous day recall. We had 15 adults that completed 2 segments of the day. So either wake up till lunchtime, lunchtime till dinner time, or dinner time until bedtime. When we look at broad location, we see that the percent agreement, so did they recall that during the segment versus the direct observation, did that behavior or did that location exist? We see high percent agreement above 85%. And then when we look a little bit more specifically at the purpose of the activity, we see that, again, the percent agreements are fairly high. The ICCs, when we look at those, were definitely strongest for activities that were more frequently recalled. There wasn't much time in education among adults, so you see that ICC is lower, but for the more common behaviors, they're all above 0.6 to 0.8. Another study looked at the Harmonized European Time Use Survey. So this is a time use diary similar to the previous day recalls that Chuck was talking about earlier. They had 140 participants who filled out the time use diary. And then they also wore a wearable camera that's shown here. The camera takes images every 10 seconds. And then those images were annotated to provide the criterion measure. So we look at the aggregate comparisons. So these are the different categories: sleep and personal care, eating and drinking. We see the time use diary here on the left, and then the camera estimates next to it. For the majority of the activities, there was less than 10% mean difference between the time use diary and the camera. And the correlations were all fairly strong. The exception of eating and drinking, that one was notably lower. And that really gets to this issue of whether someone's doing multiple behaviors at the same time. And so whether they consider their primary activity eating or watching television, while the camera may capture that eating behavior a little bit better. In that study, they found no difference in the accuracy by education level. And it is important to note that they did find substantial differences when looking at every 10-minute increment. So if you want to know exactly what someone's doing at 9:06 a.m., that may not be, you may not get that precise of an estimate. But over the course of the day, on aggregate, we're getting really comparable measures between the time use diary and the camera. So as Chuck mentioned, the iData project was an NCI-led study that was testing better measures for diet and physical activity in large cancer prevention studies. So they enrolled 1,000 adults aged 50 to 74 years, and they completed a 12-month protocol. Over the course of that time, they were sent 6 unannounced internet-based previous day recalls. So this was the ACT24 first version. And then they also wore hip-worn actigraphs and completed a past year physical activity questionnaire. So this is kind of the traditional, asks about a specific number of questions about physical activity and sedentary behavior over the course of a year. The reference measures in this study were doubly labeled water as the criterion for energy expenditure, and then ActivePal for sedentary versus active time. So in this slide here, we have the method over here on the left. The sedentary time is in red, Light activity is in yellow, and moderate to vigorous is in green. So if we look at the physical activity questionnaire as compared to ACT24, we see considerably higher estimates of sedentary time from ACT24. We also see much higher estimates of light activity and about 2 hours of moderate to vigorous per day. Interestingly, the ACT24 estimates are very comparable to the activity monitors. So with the ActivePal, we get almost identical aggregate estimates of sedentary time, and then really similar estimates of overall active time and slight differences in how it's distinguished between intensities. And for active time, the ACT24 was very comparable to the actigraph measures of active time. All right, so in this slide, we're looking at ActivePal as our reference measure, and then we're comparing the physical activity questionnaire, ACT24, and the actigraph Sojourn 3X. And then the 1, 4, and 7 refers to the number of replicate measures that were done of that particular measure. So starting with the AARP physical activity questionnaire, if we do that once, like we do in a typical prospective cohort study, the correlation with ActivePal for active time is a 0.27. And we see with the traditional questionnaire, there's not much change depending on the number of replicates that take place. In contrast with ACT24, there's a substantial increase in the correlation with more replicate measures. And similarly with the actigraph Sojourn 3X, if we have at least 4 days of data, we get more higher correlations and end up with 0.63 and 0.69. For sedentary time, the AARP questionnaire is much lower correlation with ActivePal at 0.16, and again, doesn't improve much with repeated administrations. And with 7 repeated replicates for ACT24, we have a correlation of 0.65 and 0.7 for actigraph. We also looked at overall physical activity energy expenditure from doubly labeled water, which was an average of 734 in this particular sample. When we look at the aggregate from the questionnaire, ACT24 and Sojourn 3X, we see the ACT24 had the lowest mean difference. And then again, when we look at these increasing replicates, we see the actigraph has a higher correlation, but the correlation approaches 0.6 for ACT24. So I'm going to talk a little bit more detail about the study that we recently completed using the second version of ACT24. And the goals of this project were first to evaluate the usability and the feasibility of the system linkage that Chuck mentioned when he went through the participant site. So ACT24 has the website, but we typically use REDCap to manage our study projects. So we wanted to be able to automate the deliveries to participants and then pull data back from ACT24 into that system so we could do our preliminary checks to make sure that the data was taking place. And then we also did some validation work at the same time. So we have 52 adults that completed the protocol, aged 18 to 75 years. 25 of them consented to do direct observation sessions, which was 2 3-hour sessions over the course of a week. Everybody did a 7-day protocol where they received 3 unannounced ACT24 invites, and they wore an ActivePal. So this just briefly shows what it looks like in REDCap. So you enter the participant information, then we have the URL for the actual link to ACT24, and then they could select whether they wanted it delivered via phone, email, or both phone and email. It would be an SMS text message if they selected phone. We found a mix of what participants wanted. 20% said text, 16% email, and then 16 said that they wanted both text and email. Once the study was over, 68% that said that email was easier, and 50% said that email was best. And then we found that about half of the people used a smartphone to complete it, and then 64% used a computer to complete the recalls. In terms of the quality of data, it was quite high in this study. They knew they were getting into a measurement study. So we had 92% completed all 3 recalls, and then of the submitted recalls, 93% of them were valid, which meant that they had at least 22 hours reported, less than 2 hours of missing time, and they couldn't have less than 1 hour a day or more than 22 hours a day of sedentary time. For the ActivePal, we did lose 2 devices, and we had 89% valid wear on those days, so pretty comparable in terms of the data quality coming in. In terms of usability, most people found it very or moderately easy to log in and complete the first recall. 69% thought it was easy to start the first recall, and that jumped up substantially by the time they were doing the second one. The majority found it easy to find common activities, and then find activities that you don't do often was a little bit more difficult, but still very few found it difficult. They just maybe didn't find it easy. And then when we look at how easy or difficult was it to remember what you did on the previous day, we had the lowest response of only 27% who said very easy, which made us a little bit nervous. But when we dig into the data, it's not so bad. So it actually looks pretty good. So if we look at the active PAL estimates so we have time in bed here in the kind of gold color, we have sedentary time in the middle, and then we have active time in green. So if you look at the estimates of active time, they're very similar between ACT24 and active PAL with a correlation of 0.74. And these are for matched days. So the specific date where we had both active PAL data and the day that was being recalled by the ACT24. When we look at sedentary time, the estimates from the active PAL are slightly lower than the ACT24 with a correlation of 0.6. And then time in bed is slightly higher from the active PAL and slightly lower from ACT24. And that one, the correlation was considerably lower. And what we think is happening here is that if someone gets into bed and watches television for 40 minutes, the active PAL is considered that lying time and counting that as that full time in bed bout or the sleeping estimate. Whereas with ACT24, they're specifically asked about time in bed and going to sleep. So we think that's why the active PAL is slightly higher there. When we look at sedentary time as a proportion of the waking day, it was comparable between active PAL and ACT24, and the correlation jumped up to 0.7. And then finally, this is a preliminary look at our direct observation results. So we looked just specifically now at the time spent in these different time use categories. So for exercise, the mean from direct observation is quite close to the mean from the ACT24. We had 10 of the 29 subjects reported that activity. And then the percent agreement, which means, did they recall it from a direct observation session and did they recall it from ACT24, was 93%. So people know when they exercise. With household activity, we see fairly similar mean differences. We had 14 people reporting and a percent agreement of 70%. We found that work was also, agreements were high. Personal care was the lowest at 56%, and that's really when we're coding things that's grooming behaviors and eating, which we know are things so like washing your hands or eating. There may be multiple activities taking place there, or they may be short in duration and just not recalled as accurately. But overall, the percent agreements were quite good. So to summarize, we see that people can recall what they did and where they did it with reasonably high accuracy across different previous day recall platforms, including the new ACT24 that's available as compared to direct observation. We do see that there's random error, as Chuck mentioned, both day to day and minute to minute in a previous day recall that can be considered in your study design, so making sure that you have replicate measures. And then we see that aggregate estimates of sedentary versus active time from the previous day recall are more accurate than traditional self-report questionnaires, and were comparable to the devices, for example, the Actigraph in this particular studies. So I'd like to acknowledge my team at Cal Poly, as well as the National Cancer Institute for putting together this webinar and for funding the project, as well as Chuck, Pedro, and David, who have provided input throughout. So thank you.
Sarah, fantastic talk. Thank you. And I'm sorry you can't hear the ovation from the audience.
So
That's always the downside of webinars. So before we move on to Pedro, I did want to ask you, well, first of all, it's really exciting, I think, that these 24-hour recalls appear to be solving some of the cognitive challenges of standardized survey questions, because I think they can really complement device-based measurement of activities, since they give us more information about what people are really doing, not just the intensity estimates associated with devices. The question I have for you is, there's quite a bit of evidence, as you know, that responses to standardized survey questions can be biased by respondent characteristics. Is there any evidence of that occurring in these early days with the 24-hour recalls, or is something about the structure of the instrument reducing the bias?
Yes, I'm not 100%. I'll speak to what we found in the ACT24 study with our Cal Poly participants. We definitely found that the older adults had a bit more difficulty. And when we looked at the accuracy of the sedentary versus active for people, we had 4 different age strata, and I think that they were age 60 to 75, but most of them were in their 70s, and they tended, the accuracy was a little bit lower in that group, and they had a little bit more difficulty getting started. But I think overall, I haven't seen, in the other study, the harmonized time use one, they didn't find differences by education level, but I think that that's certainly something that we need to look into, and in low literacy groups, and making sure that we're reaching people and able to help them through that. I think a key is going to be helping them through the first one so that they understand it, because then once you get through the process, it becomes easier to do.
Tremendous, thank you. So our third and last speaker, but not the least important, is Pedro Saint-Maurice, who recently promoted to research fellow in the Division of Cancer Epidemiology and Genetics, who's going to talk about some results using ACT24 in representative national samples of the US population. Thank you, Pedro. Take it away.
Yeah, thank you, David. Let me share my slides. Okay, thank you. So now what I really want to show is kind of describe some of the applications of the ACT24 we did recently while we are trying to characterize physical activity and sedentary time in a population of US adults. So my 15-minute tour, I'll go through how we use ACT24 in a Mary's Peak panel, which you heard early in this presentation. So I'll talk about that a little bit, and then explain what the NARC, or the National Opinion Research Center, is and how they work with us to collect this data, but then describe results that we collected back in the fall of 2019, and then a year later in the fall of 2020. And then finally, I'll finish up with some key points that I think are important to keep in mind regarding the application of ACT24 for large-scale deployment. But first of all, I do want to note that there's key publications that have been published with this data, and maybe take the chance to acknowledge, all the colleagues that have been involved in this work. This is not just me, for sure. Chuck, David, Sarah, colleagues at CDC, and many other folks listed on these 2 papers, and more papers that will come, hopefully. So back in 2019, we worked with NARC and access to the Mary's Peak panel participants to collect ACT24 data in adults about 20 to 75 years of age. This was a sample of about 2,600 adults, and data was collected in October, November. And then a year later, we did ask those same participants and a few more to complete ACT24 again. And I'll tell you more about that later in my presentation. So participants not only completed the ACT24, but also a short online survey, with general information. And I also want to mention that this was a population-based survey. So we were able to use sampling weights and adjust those for exclusions, non-response, and also trying to match key demographics of the population in the US. So a really unique resource. So the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago, has really wide experience setting up these type of surveys. They're all familiar for opinion and our policy-based surveys that they've done in the past, and they still do. They are a key collaborator in the Connect for Cancer Prevention here at NCI, which some of you might be familiar with. And so they were really well suited to work with us in this project. So you can see on the left, that's one of the offices. I'm guessing they're all calling people, collecting all sort of information and doing interviews. So they were kind to help us do the same to collect ACT24 information by setting links and so forth. Now at NARC, they do host and manage the Mary's Peak panel, which is a probability-based group of panelists. And these are folks that get asked to do a variety of online or phone-based studies, roughly 2 or 3 studies per month. So pretty experienced individuals with these sort of studies. So we reach out to Mary's Peak, or NARC did, and they all got invited to participate in this study that I'm about to show you. When that was done, we got about 2,600 adults that were willing to participate and that provided good and valid ACT24 data. You can see a reasonable balance, 50% between males and females, average age of 45 years old. And then if you look at the cells across the different age groups and race ethnicity, you see that we have reasonable numbers to look at subgroup results and distributions. So let's start with fall of 2019 results. What did you find by then? And I'll start going over looking at sedentary behavior. So the first thing you look at this slide is the amount or hours per day spent in sedentary time over key domains that you can see there for leisure, work, transportation, personal, household, and other. And there's probably three key pieces that you want to take from this slide. The first is that if you add that first row where it says all, that's about 9.5 hours a day on average that was reported in sedentary time across all domains. The second is, as you start looking down the plot and you see all those subgroups, male, females, by age and race ethnicity, you see that there's clear variations, right? You kind of go in the expected direction, males reporting more sedentary time than females, older adults being more sedentary, and some variations by race ethnicity that are not really systematic. And then the third thing is that if you also look at the plot, you'll see that the predominant color seems to be green, and that's leisure time. So that's showing that a good proportion of the time, about 45% of the sedentary time was coming from leisure during leisure time. So that's also important to keep in mind. So as we move forward, when you start thinking about sedentary time and start thinking about what type of activities are actually contributing to those amounts per day that people are reporting. So this is an example looking at leisure time, and you see that there's 5 major activities reported of sedentary time during leisure. You see that TV watching was the most predominant of all activities that were reported, about 40%, and then internet or computer use was the second. But it's really important to know if you get those two, that's about 70% of screen time that's been reporting as the major source of sedentary activities in the day. And then if you slide to your right and you see distributions for men and women, you kind of see similar patterns for that as well. So very interesting things to think about. And finally, we look at timing of sedentary behavior. So, and these what really are our histograms of the individual activities that were reported across the day. And with the benefits that ACT24 has those timestamps that Chuck described before, we can start looking at when were those individual activities reported in the day. So when you first look at this, if you look, for example, at leisure, that's the last row in this plot. You see that most of the activities reported, of sedentary activities reported, they were reported later in the day. That's a big proportion. It's not here, but that was about 80% or so of those activities that happen later in the day, which sort of resonates because people after work, they get home, and that's where probably a lot of the leisure time is coming from. If you look at household, it's in a way similar to that, but then as you start at other domains, personal care, transportation, or work, those are more scattered throughout the day. So let me go over parallel examinations, but this time for moderate to vigorous physical activity. I'll start with amount, just as before. You have the similar graph for the whole, for the whole sample combined, but also for important subgroups of the population. And again, if we go through the 3 key messages from this slide, the first thing you see that if you add that first row, there's about 2.5 hours on average of MVPA across all domains. And that's really important to keep in mind. And then the second is that there's important variations by sex, age, and race ethnicity, with older adults reporting less time in MVPA. And then finally, which I think it's really interesting, is that if you look at the bars again, the colors, and start trying to understand where activity is taking place in which domain, you'll see that work and household add to about 80% of total MVPA on a given day, with leisure only adding up to a little bit, about 15%. So that's really important. Historically we've been examined mostly leisure time, and that's the numbers we usually have in our head, where how much MVPA and how much active US adults are. Now with time use and ACT24, we start looking a little bit beyond that scope and seeing activity in other domains and other contexts. So moving on to type of activity, again, from all the individual activities that got reported in MVPA, about 40% were walking for exercise. And again, this is just leisure as an example. And then secondly, strength and conditioning. And then all the other remaining leisure activities that were more than the ones you see here, they were about 10% or less of the total individual activities report. And if you look to the right of the panel, you'll see some interesting patterns for men and women. You see that women, for example, report substantially more walking and cardio activities. But then if you look at strength and running, you see that men report more of those. So it's really showing some of the preferences that some subgroups of the population might have when they are being active. And then finally, going back again to our histograms for the timing of MVPA, if here, as you look, is not as obvious as what we saw with sedentary time, it does look like it's fairly similar across domains. So if you look at the peaks on the histograms and the time of the day, you see that the peaks, they seem to happen either early in the day or later in the day. And that makes sense. It's probably reflecting before and after work hours, for example. But you can see that across all domains, fairly similar patterns for work, household, transportation, and leisure. So in summary, from just what I've showed you from data collected in the fall of 2019, we see that US adults report on average 9.5 hours a day, with some subgroups being more sedentary than others, for example, as men compared to women, and that most sedentary time behaviors were taking place during leisure time, and later in the day, as we show in those histograms that I've showed you, with screen time being predominant. In terms of MVPA, we saw an average of 2.5 hours a day across all domains. Also, some subgroups more active than others, as consistent with what we've seen in the past, men more active than women. And that most of the MVPA was coming from work and household, only about 15% during leisure. So some summary remarks from what I've just shared for 2019. Now let's look at what data we collected a year after, right, in 2020, that fall. And what I'll show you just as a refresher, these were 2019 panelists that got asked again to complete the ACT24 a year later, plus a few new participants, just so we have a larger sample. But when you look at the data, there were about 1,600 panelists that had repeated measures for ACT24. That means they completed ACT24 both in 2019 and then a year later in 2020. And that's really the sample we're focusing on here. And this is still preliminary results I will share with you today. We're still working on some more. But I'll show you changes from one time point to the other in some of the key behaviors, time use, and then breaking that down to sedentary time and physical activity. Okay, so let's start by looking on to the plot on the left side for the key behaviors. So you see there, bed, sleep, sedentary time, total activity, light, and much vigorous. And then this is actually reflecting differences in hours per day. So the vertical line, if you see bars going to the left of that line, that means those behaviors, the amount of those behaviors were lower in 2020. If they are to the right, they'll be vice versa, be higher in 2020. So the first thing you notice for that image on the left is that there were no really statistically significant changes between one time point to the other. Those amounts of roughly 0.25 hours, that matches about 10 minutes or so per day. So really no change there for the key behaviors from one time point to the other. And then looking to the right for overall time use, there are two distinct things we see there. We do note that leisure time increased in 2020, so people reporting more leisure time. But then as you look down in that plot, you see that blue bar for transportation went down in 2020. So it does suggest that transportation got replaced by more leisure time in 2020, and that's very visible considering what all that happened in that last year or so. So moving on and taking that overall time use and breaking that down into sedentary time and physical activity. So we'll start with sedentary time on the left side, and you see that the changes I just told you about for time use, they all being allocated to sedentary time mostly. So you can see there's more leisure time being used in sedentary time sedentary activities, and less transportation. So again, transportation being replaced by more of the leisure activities. When you look to the right, I'm not sure if all were expecting this, but there are no changes in physical activity. They really remain very similar between 2019 and 2020. And this is a long-term assessment, right? It's a full year between the two assessments. So probably it's might be expected. So finally, just to finalize with some key points of things we realized and we learned with using ACT24 in a Mary's Peak panel. Really things that Sarah covered to some extent is the automation of ACT24 recall invitations. So everybody in the Mary's Peak were receiving unannounced recall requests to complete the ACT24, and these were links they were getting by email, on their phone, by text. But also the feasibility, the opportunity that we had to apply this to a large sample of adults. So this is about 2,500 adults, about 5,000 recalls, and all done in about 3 to 4 week period. So that's a very short amount of time for so much data, I would say. So and then with all that, you also getting detailed information on key behaviors from ACT24. The various I mentioned as amount, type, and timing, but also domain and context-specific information that we could not get otherwise. And then finally, just that the data I presented here and that we have published some of it, it is reference data. This is a probability-based survey designed to represent U.S. household population, and that's really unique as well. So with that, thank you for attending, and I look forward for some questions and discussion.
Fantastic, Pedro. Great overview of an amazingly rich data set. I'm really excited to see what continues to emerge out of these two studies. Before we open it up for everyone, let me remind you, if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A box, addressing them to all panelists, and we'll work our way through the questions, and we'll save all the questions too, and think about whether some of them might be salient to address in the frequently asked questions section of our website. But just to kick off with a question for you, Pedro, I know you've done a lot of work in the past on measurement of physical activity in children and adolescents, and people are wondering if this tool could be used, in younger age groups. And how young might we be able to extend the use of ACT24 to, given that 11-year-olds will have Instagram accounts soon?
Yeah, that's all a good question, David. Right? I mean, I could give you the classic response: if they're older than 10, they're fine, good to go. But I don't think it works exactly that way. I think time use, we probably should be thinking about adolescents. Might be a group that we can target and test and see how that works. But younger than that is really hard to tell. And you have to think if we're having, as you go, if you go with younger populations, you have to think about if you're going with parents to assist as people complete, the recalls and so forth. So there's some challenge, and it's really hard to speculate how all of these might play out. So that's probably my best answer for that, so I don't get in trouble.
Yeah, thank you. So another question arising, has probably for everyone, but maybe Chuck, you could take a stab at this, is what do you think is happening with childcare? We didn't see childcare as an activity category, yet I think a lot of people think the pandemic involved dramatic changes in how families interact with their children.
No, that's certainly true. I want to just circle back real quick to the ACT24 and youth. We did do a project where we did interview-based previous day recalls with adolescents, and we were 12 and above because that was kind of the magic number we were going for. And they did pretty well with with doing the previous day recall compared to the active pal, Sarah. So I met Sarah the first time, actually, a million years ago. And so, I think they can work through it, and I am pretty sure they know how to work a phone. So I think they wouldn't have any trouble with the technology. But in terms of childcare, we didn't delve into too much of that in Pedro's talk because we're working on those data now. We've seen some larger changes in behaviors between 2019 and 2020, essentially in the mid-pandemic compared to before it. And it did seem to affect participants in the AMERIS big panel with young children and household pretty differently than the overall. So there were some changes, but more sedentary and less active for participants who had children in the household. So that, not to be I think that's to be expected for all of the parents in the world. You know what it's been like better than I do at this point.
Tremendous. A listener asks if ACT24 currently distinguishes between indoor and outdoor activity. And then a follow-up is there a mechanism to add other kinds of contextual information to ACT24?
Yeah, the answer to the indoor-outdoor at this time, that is not explicitly asked about.
But for exercise questions, there are additional prompts. So if you say walk,
Right.
it comes up with the questions, where were you doing this exercise? Home, neighborhood, gym. So for like vacuuming, there's no additional prompts, but for exercise specifically, there is.
Right.
And then who did you do it with is also included there.
Right. So there are some insights. I think. Thanks, Sarah, for chiming in. It's very helpful. There's some activities are much more likely to be done outdoor. Lawn and garden activities, walking for transportation, cycling. So it's we don't ask about it explicitly because we decided we can only ask participants so much in these first go rounds, and that was unfortunately not one of our primary goals. And David, there was another question in there, right?
I think, well, the follow-up question, and there appears to be quite a bit of excitement in the chat box about the opportunities for extending ACT24 with contextual questions or ancillary questions about who you're with, how you're feeling, whether you're inside or outside or at church or what have you. So I think the answer is, I'll put words in your mouth, not yet, but I think this excitement in the chat box suggests that something to think about is, how can we build in opportunities to modify this kind of instrument with investigator initiated data layers, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a great question. That'll be a fun problem to have, right? We thought a lot about some of these kinds of things and decided to go kind of lean because we were just trying to learn how, if and how people could do this on a large scale and without too much burden. And the more questions you ask, the more burden there is. So we were somewhat cautious, but the examples that we have built in now that go down that road a bit are the extra follow-up questions for transportation.
Yeah.
They asked about the purpose of the trip, and then for exercise related things where we actually asked about rate of perceived exertion, where they were exercising and who they're with. So that's an example. And it would essentially that kind of module, if it could be layered in over the top of the existing setup, would essentially be additional follow-up questions for specific activities or specific categories of activities.
Yeah. So we could go on talking about this for another hour, but
Sure.
Our hour is up. And I think thanks very much to our three speakers. And kind of the final question is, where is ACT24 and what do you have to do to try it? So maybe the moderator can put up the slide of the spot, and Chuck, you can say what do you have to do to try this out and see if you think it might work for your population?
Sure. So the information about finding ACT24 is coming here. If you Google ACT24 and DCEG, you should be able to find it pretty well on our website. The researcher site is listed there, and if you want to register a study or register yourself just to play with the system, if you will, you feel free to do that. It's free. All of this is freely available to work and play with. If you, when you're registering for a study, I think there should be an option to say, I just want to play with it versus do a real study in there. Please, if you're playing, just check the play and have fun with it. Explore, see if you like it and might fit for you. But re-register for your full-on study if you decide to use it that way, and register as a full-on study so we can just kind of keep those things separate. But at the In my experience, the best way to find out if a tool or instrument could be helpful to you is to get your hands dirty working with it. And we certainly encourage that. And these are the links to find it.
Tremendous. The webinar recording will be available. Don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions going forward. And thanks again to our 3 speakers. And that's it, folks.